Well, thank you all for being so obedient, and we resume the second part of our evidence taking this morning, the absolutely final bit of the public evidence taking with two very, very welcome witnesses. That's Babu Bhattacharjee from Poplar Harker and Ian Doolittle from Trowse and Hamlins. Babu, can I say that we're immensely grateful to you, not only for being here, but also to Poplar Harker for its great generosity and help, you know, in the process of our seeking evidence in these matters. I know in general terms how positive and outgoing and helpful Poplar Harker is to other organisations from experience in another capacity, but we made a very successful visit to you. You gave us a very good time. We haven't stopped talking about it since then, and it is very good indeed to see you here this morning, and it is equally very good again to have Ian Doolittle before us. He turned in a spellbinding performance at the last public hearing at the town hall when he talked about tenancy issues and security and tenancy issues. I'm sure it's going to be an equally absorbing set of contributions. So without further ado, let me go over to you and ask you to introduce yourselves and say a little bit about what you do. Why don't we start with you first, Babu?
Thank you, Chair. My name is Babu Bhattacharjee, and I'm the Director of Communities and Neighbourhoods at Poplar Harker. We've been going for about 17 years. We're a stock transfer association and have worked closely with the local authority and actually the government of the day to establish the setup that we have. For my personal role, I manage all of our, really, the stuff that's not to do with housing very much at all, although obviously is. In reality, it's stuff like employment and training, youth work, community centres, resident engagement, so all the things that really actually add a lot of value to people's homes and people's lives.
Ian Doolittle from Trowse and Hamlins. We are lawyers and been involved with public sector housing association work and local authority work. And we've seen a large number of stock transfers, a large number of retention options being employed. So I hope, if not spellbinding, it'll be a decent performance this morning.
Fine, thank you very much indeed. And I think we begin with a series of questions primarily to Babu. Shirley.
Hi, Babu. Thank you so much for coming on this beautiful, sunny Saturday morning. We really appreciate it. Could you take us back to the beginnings of Poplar Harker and tell us about how it came into being, and particularly what were the key issues in the early days, both leading up to transfer and after the transfer first took place? Thank you.
Thanks, Shirley. We became formally established in 1998, although there had been a process before that to get us to the point where we took on about 1,000 properties to start with, and then shortly through a ballot process about 4.5, and then later up to 9,000, which is where we are now roughly. The area had declined really. Poplar, where we're based, had declined, I guess, over a period of around 20 years, where the stock wasn't in great condition, and the area, I think, was struggling with issues of vandalism and poor services. We had a situation where people were very proud of where they lived, where they were where they had moved to an area which they saw huge potential in, but where they had seen that potential change over time and really become an area where things weren't as good as they hoped they would be or that they should be. It also become a bit of a no-go area. So from the perspective of the borough as a whole, Poplar, which is on the east side of Tower Hamlets, had become, I suppose, in terms of resources, residents felt that the resources hadn't been properly balanced through the borough, so there was an inequality in terms of resources, and certainly in terms of professional expertise, people preferred not to work there. So there was a sense that it was difficult to work in Poplar, that the area was hard, and that it was easier to work in the west of the borough and to deal with issues on that side of the waters. So you tended to see services being run down, good people kind of trying hard and working there, but often becoming disillusioned and going elsewhere. And really, residents not being able to, knowing a lot of what was going on, knowing a lot of what needed to change, but not really being in a position to do that. The change was led by the local authority, so the local authority were crucial in this. They had the support of government, and crucially they had the support of local residents, so local residents were very keenly involved, and they were influential local residents too. So I think that the important point was that when the shadow board was set up, and we operated as a shadow board for a period of time before the transfers happened, the shadow board was really a third, so a third residents, a third local authority, and a third independence. So there was a sense where, in terms of that combination, the residents had the biggest role to play, and in many ways the hardest role to play, because they had a strong sense of what needed to be done, but in a way they had been the group of people who'd been least involved in what had happened on their estates. We relied hugely on the local authority and their ability to take us through this process. And I think, as with most changes, despite the preparation, despite the hard work, it was really difficult to know what we would face when the day came and the transfers happened. And I guess, I don't know how appropriate this is, but I guess it's a bit like having your first baby, where you can do all the preparation, read all the books, and prepare yourself to get ready. But when it happens, it is actually kind of throws your world kind of into a little bit of a spin. And I think nowhere more so than the residents who are taking on the responsibility to really try and make it work. And those early days were quite difficult days. You have staff working very hard, but in some ways staff are used to that. They can prepare very well, and they're used to putting the extra hours in. Local authority members, again, know kind of some of the challenges and how to get through them. I think for our residents, it was quite a difficult time, and I think most was required of them. And in many ways, it's quite easy to assume that for them that they can cope in the same way that others can, but actually it's really hard to do that volume of work, and the pressures of neighbours and what they would say to you, and the expectations they would have, and seeing that process of change through, and dealing with the difficulties that arise in those early days, because there's certainly an expectation that things will change and improve for the better, but the process of getting that change through and implementing it and dealing with the difficulties and problem solving, I think were part of those early days where you needed that capacity, and we particularly needed to make sure that as officers, our residents were properly supported, our resident board members were properly supported through that process, and allowed to really lead in some ways, because a lot of the issues that were happening on the ground. They were about residents' expectations of what change would be, and really working through that with them, and sometimes asking them to continue to support stuff even though they weren't seeing things happen exactly the way they wanted, and also being quick to respond to change where we knew it was necessary. I don't know if that quite answers the question, but
No, that's very helpful. And obviously you did this a long time ago, so it wasn't such a well-trodden path as it has been now. Is there anything in that early period of time, either before the transfer or after the transfer, that you would do differently, or Harker would do differently if they had the time again, do you think, that's about learning from experience?
I'm not sure that we identified every problem that we would face, but I'm not sure that hindsight necessarily helps, because I think that there is a real I think there's an unknown set of circumstances that are quite hard to prepare for. I think we could certainly say we could have prepared more. I think there's certainly a sense of that. I think we chose our resident board members really well, and I think that was a really important aspect of the process. They were really embedded in local communities. They were great persuaders. They were great champions for the cause, and I think that was a crucial thing. And in some ways, that was something that later on we came to rely on very heavily. And I think at the time probably didn't appreciate it as much as we ought to have done.
Thank you. And one of the really important thing I picked up from what you're saying is that you were able to successfully do a stock transfer with a lot of problems. So the stock wasn't in great condition. The area was run down. There was a lot of social disenfranchisement by the sound of it. But you were able to do it. So it's not just that you can only do a successful stock transfer if everything's rosy. Is that a fair comment?
I think that's a very fair point. I think in some ways where you have a group of people, whether they are professionals who are working in an area or people who live in the area, I think where residents have seen things not work before, that will to change and that expectation that things have to get better and that people have to do hard work to get it to that point, sometimes can be more galvanising than where you're in quite a comfortable situation and the changes are relatively small.
Could I ask, Babu, what were the incentives, in your view, for residents to vote in favour of the stock transfer? Were you delivering decent homes?
We were. So Decent Homes was a huge part of what we were doing. So it was the investment in people's homes that would really change things. And we knew the stock was in poor condition. So that was a big incentive. I think it was also the ability to really, I mean, in modern language, it would be co-production. It would be the idea that residents were actively involved in making the changes that were needed. And yes, it was about homes, but it was also about green spaces. It was certainly about community provision. So a big part of our offer was about the provision to families, to a whole range of residents, young people, older people, help getting people into work, help raising income levels, dealing with poverty. So all of those issues were huge. And I think also the sense that change was possible. So in many ways, our residents were really voting on whether they thought this method and this approach would deliver change that other approaches hadn't.
Yeah, Anthony.
Thanks, Babu. The support and indeed the enthusiasm that government has for stock transfer varies over time. And at times there's been quite significant financial support to make stock transfers happen by way of investment. Were you one of the transfers that benefited from that sort of support?
We were. So we received, so when the stock was valued, so in the stock transfer process, the stock would have been valued and there would have been payments made to make sure that when the stock was transferred, we had the budget that we needed to implement the Decent Homes work that was required. I think we're also looking at other ways to generate income, and certainly in terms of the area, there were opportunities for development which would raise finance too, and we knew that in some cases actually demolition was a better option than refurbishment, and it was the ability to borrow money as well that was important, because at the time that was a restriction on the local authority.
Thanks, Babu. I just want you to take us through how you built the organizational culture of Poplar Arc and how this has impacted on performance and achievement. Thank you.
I think the organizational culture is a huge part of what I think led to our success. It was really important that we were able to change the way things had been done previously. I think that we were working in an area that had huge levels of deprivation in terms of the statistics. That's not represented by the people who live there, who were and are amazing and very talented. But actually, in terms of some of the issues that were there, they pointed to lots of people coming to the area and saying they were going to change things, and actually running out of energy, not delivering on their promises. And so there was a real sense, I think, that we tried it hadn't worked. What's different about you? Why are you going to do something that hasn't been done before. So it's really important culturally and within the team that we had staff who could listen to that, but also change things subtly, because it's important to have success. So I think it's important to have a culture that values success, but also recognises that change and success doesn't come easily, and particularly in areas where we've had examples where people have come with the best of intentions but haven't delivered. So change isn't quick. It sometimes isn't cheap, and it sometimes isn't easy. And you need staff who are prepared to go through those hurdles and deliver that success over time. So I think it's important to really work as a team. It was a very hard-working team in the early days. You tend to not know what you need until you get properly into the issues that you're facing. So you need an adaptable team. You need to bring in specialists when you realise what some of the issues are, and I think the focus on working together with residents and really not trying to work in a way that values kind of professional expertise above the expertise of people who understand the problem better, have lived through that problem, and actually have some very good solutions to that problem. So working through the solutions together was a really important part of the culture. Staff have to enjoy what they're doing, so it's really important that there's a good relationship and that staff are getting some rewards from what they do. They're seeing the benefits of the change. It's an enjoyable process, and I think it needs to be that from the point of view of everyone who's involved. And I think as soon as it becomes a chore, I think you sometimes lose that spark that you need to get things going.
Yeah, just picking up on that, Babu. When you encountered resistance amongst staff, how did you go about trying to convince them that there were new ways of working, and that it was essential that they became part of this new way of working? And what steps did you take, or what steps did you need to take should that resistance become sort of embedded and you had to do something about it? What did you have to put into place?
Yeah, I think that there's a series of tools that I think we used to bring the kind of culture that we wanted, and those are things about embedding the culture of the new organisation, lots of training, lots of intervention, kind of at top, middle, and bottom within the team. I think understanding the role of residents, and then I think most of our staff had worked closely with residents, so I don't think that was the issue. But I think it was understanding the collaborative nature of the work now, and how that could be created. I think it's about showing people what we wanted to do, so that there were real examples that we could point to in terms of the kind of culture we wanted to create. And I think there were staff who, with lots and lots of work and lots of effort from the broader organisation, just would not pick up on the kind of change and the kinds of things that we needed to do. And in those cases, I think you do look to move people on, and try and develop the culture that we wanted to create. So I think that we give it our best shot, we work hard, but sometimes I think you have to accept that for some people, the organisation that we're trying to create isn't right for them, and then we look at ways to perhaps get them into other careers or to move on. It's good to introduce new people in that situation, because sometimes I think where you can start afresh, if you like, and people aren't banking on their history of 20 years of doing things a certain way, that can be very powerful. And I think that's something that we did quite quickly. So to take an experienced team, but then to add people who are new to the culture and really got the culture from the off.
Peter.
Babu, you talked early on about how important the local authority was in helping you get set up and on your way, but you've been there 17 years now. How's that relationship with the local authority evolved over that time? Where is it up to now, and how do you work together as partners?
Yeah, it varies over time. So I would say that I think we have been very careful to say that we were created by the local authority. We need the local authority. It's very much a mutually beneficial relationship, and it's something that we work very hard to sustain. As with any relationship, I guess, there are ups and downs, and I think that we are quite a political organisation with a small p, but we get actively involved in being a champion for the area, and I think that our relationships locally with local councillors are very strong. Our relationships sometimes with the political leadership can wax and wane, and there are times in which we've been in disagreement. We've disagreed with the view of the council leaders, and we've made that clear. I think it is about presenting those arguments in a logical way. It is about building up the evidence for what we think and why we think it. But I think we do recognise that we represent the views of a lot of different people who are our residents or who live in the local area, and to some extent our role is to champion those views and to make those views clear to the local authority. Sometimes I find that there is sometimes an ebb and flow about these things, that where you get on very well with the members or very well with the political leadership, sometimes the officers aren't so helpful, and that it often happens the other way around, that when the officers are kind of very helpful, the members sometimes aren't. So I think there is a way of these things evening out, and I'm not sure if that's just part of the nature of these things, but there does seem to be you look for friends in different places, I think, as the relationships change, and I think it's always possible to find allies and to find relationships which help, and the local authority is quite a big and complicated organisation, and sometimes being able to understand its various kind of personalities is sometimes very helpful.
Thanks for that. Could I just follow up? I don't want you to be indiscreet, but I just wonder if I could push a bit further and ask you if you know how you're seen locally. Are you seen, for example, with all the work that you do for the neighbourhood and on the wider social agenda, are you seen as an exemplar, or are you seen perhaps as an elite? What's the view of Poplar Harker from outside the walls?
It's interesting, actually. So I think that to some extent, I think the wider view outside of the borough is probably very, very positive about Poplar Harker and positive about our work. I think as you get down to very local levels, it can vary dramatically, and so on a local estate where there's a particular issue, you might find that those residents are particularly annoyed with what they see as Poplar Harker's view of a particular situation. And I think it's sometimes about understanding that those relationships shift over time as well, and so although there may be particular areas of work where we have a very strong reputation, there will be others where we will be in small scale or sometimes larger conflict with particular interests or particular groups of people. I don't think we shy away from that. I don't think that the principle is that we will always be loved and we can never do anything that would upset anybody, and part of the process of regeneration is that there are often at quite a micro level kind of individual winners and losers. Sometimes there are power bases on local estates which rely on certain things being retained, and they're not always best for the area. And sometimes when you challenge those power bases, it can create tensions, and that can happen both at the political level and at a state leadership level. I think for us, it's the sure-footedness around those interventions, and so I don't think I'm scared of upsetting people, but equally I know that we might be allies again in a few months, and I think it's retaining the relationships that you never lose that sense of respect for each other, even though you're disagreeing on a particular point.
Charlie?
Just to follow up on that's interesting, Babu, and it's something that I was thinking of asking you later, but it probably comes in here. Individual residents, for good reasons, are concerned with their local area, particularly with things like their rent, their service charges, etc. residents who are involved in governance have to have a different hat on. So things like rent rises, although obviously we're hearing about government intervention in that. How do residents manage that transition from thinking about local to thinking about the bigger future of the population, and how does Poplar Harker help them with that?
Yeah, that's a really big part of our work, and it starts from really quite a long-term process of engagement with residents. It can be very difficult for residents. An example in our case was where our board might take a decision not to refurbish a block because demolition's a better option, and so you're having to face your neighbours and say, actually, you're not going to get your new windows and new kitchens and bathrooms because the better option is for us to wait until we can regenerate fully. And I think that it's a process of developing leadership and developing confidence and developing understanding of the different roles with those individual residents. We have a skilled resident empowerment team who've developed their knowledge over a period of time. They're often individuals who've been involved in that process themselves, so they understand the changes that have to apply. And it is quite difficult, and I do think that what's been great is to see residents come through that process and be able to advise other residents on some of those difficulties. But there is no doubt that there are difficult decisions that have to be made. And I don't know, actually, I may be being a bit unfair on our independent residents, but it's quite easy to go somewhere else and not have to face the individuals that you've made a tough decision about, every day on the street, in the shops, and I think that makes the decision, actually, it means that we have to consider it very carefully, but I think it hasn't stopped us making difficult decisions. So sometimes you might think that would be a process that held people back, and as residents they would feel like I didn't want to do anything that would make me unpopular. Actually, it hasn't compromised their ability to consider the issues and make decisions in terms of the best interests of the area.
Ian, finally to you.
I was enjoying that very much.
I could see that. What would be involved in achieving registration for a new registered provider to take transfer of the Hammersmith and Fulham stock?
Well, I think I'm here this morning to guide the Commission through the processes that would be run by the Greater London Authority in its capacity in London as you like, the almost the guide, the sort of semi-regulator for the transfer process, and also the role of the Homes and Communities Agency, which has responsibility for registering any new stock transfer organisation. So in this case, it's a matter primarily for the HCA to look at any transfer organisation, just as the Housing Corporation had to worry about Poplar Harker and its ability to govern its own affairs many, many years ago. In this case, things have moved on since whatever it was, 1998, and we have a new regulatory framework, and that is really the rule book for new registered providers, and it is the ability, the confidence, if you like, that the HCA officials have that the new transfer organisation can comply with that regulatory framework, which will be critical in determining whether the new organisation will be registered or registrable or not. There are a series of standards, consumer standards, economic standards, which are variously applied. Not all will be capable of being delivered on day one. I think the jargon is that there is a reasonable path to compliance for those things which can't be assuredly ticked off, if you like, at the beginning. But certainly for the key standards, the economic standards, in particular governance and viability, the HCA officials will be poring over the paperwork. They would actually come to the meetings. I think we heard earlier about the shadow organisation or organisations that would be established in the pre-registration phase to see how the organisation was getting along, because a board in shadow form would be appointed in ways which the Commission has begun to think about, if that's the route that's pursued, and then they would say, is this body capable of governing this organisation well, and then poring over the paperwork, as I said, to see whether the organisation is likely to be viable or not. And certainly the current uncertainty makes that a more challenging task than it would have been in the past. And I don't think it's betraying any secrets to say that previous transfer organisations who have been assuming various levels of rent increase through their business plans will be going into a huddle now and working out what the implications are of these forthcoming 4 years of rent reductions. But at any rate, you know, as it were, what if this is the route that's chosen, you'll know that there is uncertainty, and you're certainly in a better position, or the organisation would be in a better position than its counterparts, if this is the way it goes, who have just proceeded with transfers and then found that in fact the rent rules have changed.
I know we talked earlier about timetables, and I know, especially because of looking at the implications of the recent budget, it's probably even more difficult to put timetable. But in your experience, having had dealt with stock transfers in the past, can you give some kind of timetable for this? And also, just kind of a second supplementary question, how much do you take into account legal challenges?
Well, there's two questions there. One is, I think Mike's answer was the best answer one can give in the circumstances, which is to look at the transfer manual, which talks in terms of 18 months. And 18 months, I think, is a very fair spread of time to be thinking about. Just with one gloss on what Mike said, not to qualify it, but just to have it lodged in people's minds. I think the 31 March 17 is not a bad minimum date, but it might well be too challenging. But very often these programs invariably do run, if there is a new program, from 1 April through to 31 March. It is invariably the case, not always, but invariably the case, very often the case that the transfers get completed in March. Blame the lawyers for expanding their rows and their problems to fit the time available. So nothing like a bit of last minute sort of arm wrestling on the 31st of March when the clock is ticking. You know, it's amazing the points that fall in at that last moment. But work, I think, on 18 months, and if it's not the 31st of March 2017, then it'll be at some point in the following financial year, rather, and let's hope the lawyers don't push it on to the next 31st March. Oh, sorry, legal challenges. Yes, you do take account of legal challenges in two respects. One is that these cunning civil servants and their equally cunning housing ministers changed the system recently because they introduced another notice process to allow for the possibility that people would challenge the outcome of the ballot effectively. In other words, giving the Secretary of State, whose ultimate decision this is, an opportunity to consider representations and to make, as it were, his or her decision more secure. There was a concern arising from one or two instances where the Secretary of State was concerned about making a decision which then could be challenged. More likely, and it happens very rarely, and more often threatened than as it were emerges in practice, is the possibility that a tenant disgruntled by the process, or more likely the outcome of the vote, would seek judicially to review the decision of either the council to proceed with transfer, either to apply to the Secretary of State or to sign the document, the transfer agreement, or less likely now because of the new process, the Secretary of State. And that is certainly taken into account, and in one or two instances arrangements have been put in place to anticipate the as it were, the expiry of any challenge period. So that is, as it were, factored into the legal processes we follow.
What about legal challenges from, say, the political opposition?
Well, this is a decision for the council at the time. A little mischievously, I can remember back in 1992, and I can take Keith into political territory here, and Nick Rainsford actually was the prospective housing minister. And I remember we had a transfer, it was Bromley, I think, I remember, and there was lots of political excitement, and I hope it's not going over old ground, but it was expected that the Labour Party would take power in 1992. And I remember being asked, well, Nick Rainsford said, well, he wouldn't feel bound by the decision of the Secretary of State on the Bromley transfer. And I rather misread said, it's not a question whether he feels bound, it's whether he would be bound by that decision or not. And there is process within the legislation, or there's provision within the legislation for that Secretary of State decision to be final. And the same is true of local authority decisions. It is a decision for the democratically elected administration of that time to make a decision. I expect you're thinking in your mind, well, doesn't that fetter the future discretion of the council? No, in my view, this is a moment at which that discretion is exercised, and if a decision is made to transfer and the transfer takes place, that is not unscramblable, if you like, by a subsequent administration. That is a decision that has been made, the transfer happens, and we all move on, even if the incoming administration might have preferred a different decision to have been taken.
Ian, so I just wanted to know what the process, would the process be different if the proposal was to transfer the stock to an existing registered provider? And that could be either a straightforward transfer or a discrete local subsidiary.
Yes, I think the answer is both more and less difficult. I think it's less difficult in the sense that I think the governance challenge for the HCA officials, I was talking earlier about the HCA officials coming to have a look at a transfer organisation, I think they will take comfort from the fact that if it is to an existing organisation, and I think the stock this size, I think it's probably, I'm prepared to be bold and say it's beyond contemplation. This stock would be taken into an existing registered provider. Too many properties, even for the largest, quite apart from the fact that tenants, I don't think, would vote in favour of a proposition which involved stock going straight in. I think we're looking here at a subsidiary, as you indicate. So the ACA officials would look at governance and say to themselves, well, I want to be convinced, and yes, I am pretty convinced that this new organisation is fit for purpose as far as governance is concerned, but any doubts that I may have are allayed by the fact that it will be surrounded, so to speak, by support from an existing registered provider. They will be providing the same sort of support that Stephen was talking about earlier with regard to the local authority, IT, and some financial support and so on and so forth. So, as well as the general support in terms of audit and so on that helps give HCA officials confidence. Less difficult, less straightforward, more difficult, in other words, in terms of viability. I think it's easier for the HCA to look at an existing a standalone organisation and say, does this work in terms of viability? They will worry about an organisation taking on, even in the form of a subsidiary, a large number of properties as Hammersmith and Fulham have. That's a big swallow. There will be a big investment programme. In other words, does the new organisation have the capacity. You know, what are they taking on more than they should be taking on? So I think it's difficult to say. Very often we don't get to that point, because by and large, I think it's worth passing this on, that we would be looking at, as a rule of thumb, I know Merton was a little different, but 5,000 properties or less. It used to be much lower than that as a number, but you might be looking at a subsidiary option. Certainly, anything substantially in excess of 5, certainly 10 and above, you would be saying to yourselves, this is a standalone proposition.
Fine. Anthony, this Anthony.
This Anthony, sorry, forgive me.
Too many Anthonys. Chair, 90% of our audience have been with us throughout, but can I just start by clarifying that the term private registered provider is the completely ridiculous legal name for a housing association. I wish it wasn't, but it is. So when we talk about registered providers, we mean housing associations. They're the same thing. So to my question, as you and I know, Ian, the process of making a housing transfer happen is a highly regulated one, subject to lots of guidance by lots of organisations, nationally, many of which you've named now. Now, with the new government in place since May, we don't have a current housing transfer manual. But if we did have one, I want to ask you to speculate what might be in it, what might be important to this government to see a housing transfer deliver, in your view.
I think they would love Poplar Harker.
But without paying for it.
Without paying. Yeah, they're not keen on paying for things, that's for sure. And yes, you teased out the fact that there was dowry money available in those days, so a very different proposition. But I say they love Poplar Harker because of the, if you like, the economic and social regeneration aspects of the Poplar Harker. Well, after all, Housing and Regeneration Community Association. I remember having long conversations with Steve Stride in those heady days. And they were actually pioneering in many respects, including governance, so hats off to them. So meeting the government's policy objectives, which are set out at the moment, as you say, in a transfer manual which would not apply to this transfer because it only goes to 31st March 2016, I don't see any reason to anticipate that will not be a consideration. I believe in formal conversations with HCA and GLA officials, and in this respect we've yet to see whether the GLA is going to take a different approach to the HCA, as far as I can tell at the moment, because they're in the last round of transfers, these were all HCA and not GLA transfers, so there's a bit of a caveat there. Not just that the manual is expiring and there'll need to be a new one if there is a new transfer program. I sense that there will be, but that we may have a particular voice from the GLA which we haven't yet identified. But anyway, the 31st March 2016 expiring manual talks about economic and social regeneration. I see no reason why that will not be a major consideration for them, particularly in urban areas like this. So that's the policy priority in a sort of soft sense, but in the hard sense, I don't think there's any indication at all, quite the reverse, given the budget announcements, that this will not be driven by value for money consideration. So I'd imagine the Commission will have further questions for me about that, so far as I can answer them from my perspective, but I think the cost to the taxpayer will be of fundamental importance. I can't see the days of dowry funding returning. I think it's worth emphasising where the government comes from on this. I may have said this last time, but stepping back, whenever it was, 1st of March 2012, local authorities which retained their stock were treated in the same way they felt as stock transfer organisations. As Anthony will well remember, PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers did the valuation work And there are many parallels between the valuation process for self-financing and the valuation processes and criteria for stock transfer. And so government says, I hope not too colloquially, why are we hearing from you now? In 2012, we set you up on a basis which, read the words on the tin, allowed you to finance yourselves. Now, as Mike not unreasonably said earlier, I think they've torn up some of those assumptions and that comfortable basis on which there was a quid pro quo. We'll give you freedom, and you will take responsibility. The cynic would say that's what localism is about. And they have, by intervening in rents, as it were, undermined that policy position. But nevertheless, they will still be saying, we know what the value of the stock is, because we settled that in 2012, and as the transfer manual currently shows, and I'm sure it will continue to show, you must justify any departure from that transfer valuation. We must see why we need to pay for the write-off of debt, and given the background in 2012 and the fact that stock is meant to be at Decent Homes, or we've given you the money to maintain it at Decent Homes standard, then you're on the back foot the moment you walk into the room. So convince us. Now, last year, as they proclaim in the transfer manual, they spent £300 million, give or take, on 3 transfers: Durham, Gloucester and Salford. So, and I do think, informally, once you get momentum, and I think Keith was articulating this very well earlier, once you kind of get into the room, you get the government officials interested in the proposition, then they are saying, well, perhaps we can raid our budget. And I think it is a budget which the DCLG have to manage themselves. It used to be a treasury matter to sort of, as it were, rub out the old housing debt, and it didn't seem to cause them any difficulty. Now it is real money for CLG within their budget. Once you get into their psyche, under their skin, and say, look, there's a really exciting thing going on in Hammersmith and Fulham. It's going to cost you, whatever it might be, certainly be tens of millions of pounds, I think, with debt write-off. Any stock transfer of any size is going to be in that order. We're getting under your skin, and we're convincing you that there's something exciting to be delivered. It will cost you. It's not a dowry, but it is debt write-off. Please help us.
Ian, and maybe Babu as well, I wonder if I could just push that question a bit wider. Reading between the lines of what's coming out of the Conservative government about its view of social housing, is there possibly an opportunity here to try and think about a new type of registered provider in the light of what the present government expects social housing providers to do and be?
Do you want to have a go, or shall I? Do you want to start? Shall I? I'm very grateful. It would be nice to think so, Peter. The governance models which we've been exploring so far, and I know Scott talked to the Commission about the other evening, are as imaginative as the current rules allow, and it may be the Commission will want to ask further questions about this later. Government, the HCA, and I'm sure the GLA, and the HCA certainly as regulator, have no difficulty with, and certainly encourage, tenant-led organisations. And I do think whether it's Gateway or Rochdale Mutual, whatever it might be, I don't think that presents any difficulty to them. Where government, as it were, departs from the HCA is that I don't think anymore, I hope this is not unkind, they are not seeing stock transfer as a policy priority. So they're not straining to either change the rules themselves or to encourage the HCA to take a new approach. So, for example, this is slightly sort of left field, but in many respects, at least as far as governance is concerned, and you might make this a funding proposition too, you could achieve the objectives of the incoming Labour administration, the current Labour administration, by attacking the proposal, the requirement, and it is in the transfer manual. They're not quite set up, and it doesn't have lights shining on it. The requirement that the transferee is a freeholder. In other words, it takes the properties freehold. There is, if you could persuade the government to revisit the way in which it looks at these things, to have freehold retained by the local authority in a long leasehold for the transfer or organisation, or, which avoids the ownership issue, or, more likely, and more neatly, an arrangement by which the freehold is owned by the tenants in some sort of trust arrangement, and a long lease is sent back to the local authority. That's not available under the current rules. There's no indication that government is prepared to push back on, and I think this is the key point, the Treasury. I tried to run a model which left the debt retained. After all, why would you try to repay debt or write off debt at often low rates of interest when you could leave it sitting there and just have it serviced by the new transfer organisation? If government, in other words, were really set on a new form of stock transferee and a new way of doing transfer, they would have allowed what we called a COCO, council-owned, community-owned model for Gloucester to fly. And by all accounts, it was, as it were, discouraged, to put it politely, by Treasury. And so I don't think there's enough will within government to want to push for a new model. Their role, they think, is to protect the taxpayers' interests and to make sure that if they are going to write off debt, they're getting something for their and the taxpayers' money. And the HCA doesn't seem as if it's minded to change its conventional RP, Registered Provider Housing Association model, for stock transfer. Anyway, that's my view. Have we anything that you want to add?
I suppose I was just going to say that there doesn't seem to be a lot of love for housing associations at the moment in government size, and I wonder if that's not just true of the current government, but also the opposition. Ian Duncan Smith, I remember, was really upset by what was happening at Walthamstow with the dog track and London and Quadrant. Jim Fitzpatrick, our MP, was unhappy with One Housing and the way that they were managing their stock. So I guess in terms of your relationship with government, it may be a good time to be coming forward with a model and perhaps kind of learning from the current political position and perhaps the mistakes that some of us have made. I mean, I wouldn't say that Poplar Harcourt was particularly part of that, but I think as a sector we probably haven't done enough to persuade politicians that the models that we are implementing and the way we're going about it are entirely in keeping with their views. So I think it is an opportunity.
Andy?
This question's for Ian. If we were to favour housing transfer to an organisation with a very strong measure of tenant control, such as a gateway or a mutual, would that have any impacts on the transfer process overall, especially on the registration processes, and what would they be?
I think I'm conscious of time, and I think I can be brisk because I've touched on this a little earlier, but it's important to focus on as a separate question. They certainly wouldn't discourage tenant-led models, whether they are Gateway, Rochdale Mutual, or otherwise. The process is likely to be lengthier, or it might be lengthier both before and after transfer, and I say that for two reasons. One is the Gateway model in its classic form requires or anticipates the if you like, building up of tenant empowerment on a area or sub-area by sub-area basis, more likely you are to proceed straight to a, as it were, a wholesale gateway model and then allow for subsequent devolution. In Rochdale, they went to a conventional form of stock transfer organisation on day one, but worked towards a mutual structure within 2 years after transfer. And that was all fully set out in the paperwork, and it's now in place. So initially it was a conventional stock transferee, and it's now become Rochdale Mutual, a Rochdale Mutual in its full form. So no discouragement for the tenant-led model itself, but a lengthier process.
Thanks very much. Andy, final question, I think, to Kim.
Thanks. This is for both of you, I think. Babu mentioned about learning from mistakes just now. And so what do you think are the key lessons we should take on board, and how can we design in success if we're contemplating recommending a transfer?
I would say to have a really strong regeneration focus, to really understand the drivers for government and what they want to achieve, and to stick to your principles and to be really strong on what you stand for, and not to compromise on that.
And the speakers are joined up because I just reiterate what I said earlier: get under the skin of the officials and emphasise, which I think will be the key sort of interesting factor, if you like. The thing that grabs the attention will be regeneration. In all likelihood, that's what the new transfer manual is likely to say. So regeneration is, and be firm about value for money, but for heaven's sake, be ready to answer